We're going to be in Proverbs chapters 11 to 12 today, and this is continuing on in the major section of Proverbs where we get into pretty much those short, pithy sayings, and it's really hard to organize. But we'll look at some methods of organization real quick. It's going to be a little difficult, but they're there. If you look hard enough for them, you can see the organization in this section. And let's quickly review what we talked about in the last couple weeks. So we'll start with the background of Proverbs. So as we were going through in our first study on Proverbs, we learned a little bit about the background. And most of it was written by Solomon. You can think of chapters 1 to 24 as pretty much all written by Solomon. And even after that, you have words from Solomon transcribed by Hezekiah's men. Which brings up the next point. So we have some editors in the book of Proverbs. So if you go to Proverbs chapter 25, you'll see these also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. So they've gathered his collection together of Proverbs, starting in chapter 25, and kind of laid them all down, the ones that they transcribed. You also see some other, most likely editorial notes, such as Proverbs 1:1, and, starting at chapter 10 as well, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, perhaps an editorial note. And if we take Hezekiah's men as the last kind of people who had a hand in Proverbs, we know we have to include them anyway, right? It's in chapter 25. So that gives us a date at around 700 BC, if they were the last people who had a hand in the book of Proverbs. So it's around 700 BC, a few hundred years after Solomon. So those were pretty much the last editors. Most conservative commentators believe that and hold that. And we don't have evidence of anything else, really. So that's pretty much the best way to take it. We also have other authors in the book of Proverbs. We have Augur, for instance, later on in the book of Proverbs. And at the end, we have King Lemuel at the end of the book of Proverbs. And perhaps an anonymous section all the way at the end where the structure widely differs from King Lemuel's words. But we'll get into that when we get into that. We're not in there yet. So that's pretty much the basic structure. You can kind of divide it up into authors and Solomon's sections. So the first major section is pretty much 1 to 7. That first introduction, where we get this introduction about wisdom and why Solomon is giving us these words. And verse 7, we can call that the motto of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And after that, Solomon gets on into this kind of fatherly instruction role, where he's teaching anyone who would like to listen, and he's teaching them as a father would. So he talks about immorality, talks about the sluggard, and, general wisdom for living well and living righteously. Talks about the pitfalls of immorality, talks about the adulteress a lot in a number of chapters. Pretty much a third of this whole section talks about the adulteress and warns us, and warns his son and anyone who would listen about the adulteress. And here and there you'll see some allusions to this wisdom character. It could be personified wisdom, either an attribute of God or perhaps just an abstract virtue. And in chapter 8, especially when you start at verse 22, we get into wisdom, and some people believe that we're talking about the Logos, or the Son of God, perhaps. For instance, if we read Proverbs 8:22, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. This is wisdom speaking. Whoever or whatever wisdom is. Before his works of old, from everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. Then I was beside him, verse 30, as a master workman. I was his daily delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. So you could take that as the Son of God. You could bring in that Corinthians passage too. That's usually what they do, where it says that Christ is the wisdom and power of God. So those are options. And we looked at some difficulties in that interpretation. In chapter 9, we have the antithesis of wisdom. You have the woman of folly. Who could that be if we're talking about persons here? We also looked at a couple more difficulties, such as what does it mean that wisdom was established? What does it mean to have a hand in the creation there? It definitely could be the Son of God. It could be Christ. But there are some difficulties with that interpretation that would have to be resolved if you take that. Such also as, in chapter 2, in chapter 1, really, at the end of chapter 1, you see wisdom shouting in the streets. So either you have wisdom as a figure of speech of a figure of speech, or else you'd have to say that Christ was shouting in the streets and doing all those things that wisdom was doing. And in chapter 9, wisdom's preparing a table, hewn out her 7 pillars. And this is all things that a lady of the house would do in order to prepare a feast. So she's inviting people to the feast, sending out her maidens, calling. So it'd be difficult to see Christ doing those things. Otherwise, you'd have to have a figure of speech of Christ not literally doing those things, but figuratively doing those things, and yet the whole thing's also a figure of speech. So there's some difficulties to that, so you can certainly take the Son of God as an interpretation if you want, though. It's certainly a possibility. That's pretty much chapters 1 to 9, and chapter 10. And I'll get into some questions if you guys have any on the summary, after the summary. So chapter 10 begins with the Proverbs of Solomon. So if you recall, back in chapter 1, verse 1, we heard another introduction, Proverbs of Solomon. It was slightly longer, but now we have another introduction to the Proverbs of Solomon. And this marks the next major section, which pretty much extends to chapters 10 to 22. You could also bring it out to chapter 24, up until chapter 25, where we see the men of Hezekiah and the words they've transcribed from Solomon. But chapter 10 starts the next major section. 1 to 9 was about fatherly instruction. We heard about personified wisdom, or perhaps the Son of God, an allusion to him, or prophecy of him. And chapter 10 begins with the Proverbs of Solomon again. So you have to keep in mind that Proverbs, it can be used in a number of different ways. So it can be used for longer discourses and fatherly instruction, which is what Solomon gives in 1 to 9. And then we see in 10 to 22, 24, you see more of the short, kind of pithy sayings. The things that we're more familiar with as far as Proverbs are concerned. So kind of short, pithy sayings, and they're very difficult to organize because of that. But there is an organization to it, and you could think of chapters 10 to 12, which we'll be reading, 11 and 12. We already read 10 earlier. But you can think of these as contrasting the righteous and the wicked. So you'll see this is the righteous man, this is the wicked man. This is what righteousness looks like. This is what wickedness looks like. These are the consequences of righteousness. These are the consequences of wickedness. So just bear all that in mind. So before we do read, though, we're going to ask for some questions if you have any. Short ones. Got to have them short for the summary. So any short questions on the summary so far?
Not at the moment.
All right, that's good, because we do have to keep going on. If you do have questions, though, you can check the previous studies out. They've all been recorded in the Study Recordings channel. But let's get into some quick notes. And I think these are very important, because as we keep reading on, especially in this next section, things are getting more difficult. So before we could easily organize things, just looking at a section, okay, this is about wisdom, this personified wisdom. Okay, this section is about the adulteress. Now things are going to get more difficult. So just read some words from Walter Kaiser to help, guide our study a little bit here. Some time ago, I had made a similar point by noting that so much of the book of Proverbs was a mere representation in proverbial form of what had been announced in the legal sections of the Torah. Therefore, wisdom is not offered as a substitute for faith or belief. It's offered to teach those who have found faith in the coming seed of promise through the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, and about how we are to live the life of obedience as an evidence of that faith. Unlike the law of God in the Torah, from which so much of the book of Proverbs finds its spiritual source, wisdom expands on the same themes and instructs how one can put these same principles into practical and useful application in everyday life. So just keep that in mind as we're reading through Proverbs. He continues on, its teaching may appear at times to be so secular and devoid of spiritual principles that it merely demands good social graces and common sense. But we're assured that God is just as interested in what we may relegate to the realm of the mundane and trivial as he is in the mega decisions and movements of our day. He must be Lord over all aspects of life and living. So you'll notice that sometimes as you read a proverb. It might be, where you might ask, where's God in this proverb? And it seems like it's just about, work hard, for instance, labor hard. Look at the ant, oh sluggard. Don't be like a sluggard, be like an ant who still works despite not even knowing what it's doing or having a real ruler or king in any sense of the word. And we already looked at ants. We looked at the queen a little bit, the queen ant, and she was more of a reproductive element of a colony and not necessary for ants to be working, which was the whole point of the proverb anyway. So any final questions? We'll probably get into just a little more. I kind of want to bring up one more little thing on genre. But yeah, if you have questions, keep thinking of them. But one more thing. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I normally don't in any way disagree with your commentaries, but I think, and you tell me what you think, but I think that when I read Proverbs, I never really felt it was secular, just because it's within the context of the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. So that's the whole book's context. When it talks of departing from evil and doing good, it says the fear of the Lord is what that causes. It causes us to turn from evil and to do good. So whenever you read of doing good instead of evil, it's within that context overall. And then also, I see a lot of times where it talks about how the righteous will be diligent, or the righteous care for the life of their animal. It doesn't say the good or the morally upright, although it can sometimes use those words. But most of the time it uses the word righteous. And it uses this idea of godly, God-fearing, and that kind of stuff. So, although, of course, sometimes it can have very utterly practical advice that is true regardless, in a sense, at least somewhat, of being a Christian. I think that it's, at least from what I've read of it, very interwoven with the whole concept of fearing the Lord being the motivation to live righteously, which includes diligence and includes honesty, loyalty, integrity, all those things.
Yeah, I think you're in agreement with the commentary there pretty much. And I like what you said. Whenever you see something good, whenever you see something diligent, yeah, you could think of that secularly if you isolate it completely out of its context. But if you read especially larger sections of Proverbs at a time, you'll definitely be able to see where God is involved, where righteousness specifically is involved, and all of that. So, Kaiser's just saying some people, sometimes they might be able to see things a little more secularly than you should. But apparently you don't see it that way, which is good.
No.
All right, one more thing from Kaiser. And if you're interested, these quotes are from Preaching and Teaching from the Old Testament, A Guide for the Church by Walter Kaiser. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think these particular quotes are good. So he says in this next one, in some ways, Proverbs are not all that different from narratives, for in some sense, Proverbs arise out of recurring storylines. No wonder, then, that Proverbs have been defined as short sentences founded upon long experiences containing a truth. Recurring patterns of stories gave rise to a short sentence that tended to wrap up the truth of the narrative in a memorable phrase or line. Now, that's very important to keep in mind, especially in this next section that we're in, chapters 10 to 22 or 24, however you want to divide that up. But it's very important because we're really getting into the short sentences. Before we had longer discourses, longer topics, we could easily see all of that, and now things are much more difficult to see. But there, you can see a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and, if you want to be called on to read, just go to the Bible Study React channel. Let me just put it there for you. Go to that channel, react to that message, and I'll have a list of people I can call on to read and maybe participate explicitly. You can participate without, reacting to that message like Matt's been doing, which is good. But it's helpful to have a list of people I can just call on to read. All right, let's go ahead and read the first section, which is Proverbs chapter 11, verses 1 to 21. And Mia has reacted to the message. So Mia, could you please read that section for us? 1 to 21 of chapter 11.
Dishonest scales are detestable to the Lord, but an accurate weight is his delight. When pride comes, disgrace follows, but with humility comes wisdom. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the perversity of the treacherous destroys them. Wealth is not profitable on a day of wrath, but righteousness rescues from death. The righteousness of the blameless clears his path, but the wicked person will fall because of his wickedness. The righteousness of the upright rescues them, but the treacherous are trapped by their own desires. Wealth vanishes. The righteous one is rescued from trouble. In his place the wicked one goes in. With his mouth the ungodly destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous are rescued. When the righteous thrives, a city rejoices, and when the wicked die, there is joyful shouting. A city is built up by the blessing of the upright, but it is torn down by the mouth of the wicked. Whoever shows lost my place. Whoever shows contempt for his neighbor lacks sense, but a man with understanding keeps silent. A gossip goes around revealing a secret, but a trustworthy person keeps a confidence. Without guidance, but with many counselors there is deliverance. If someone puts up security for a stranger, he will suffer for it, but the one who hates such agreements is protected. A gracious woman gains honor. A kind man benefits himself, but a cruel man brings disaster on himself. The wicked man earns an empty wage, but the one who sows righteousness a true reward. Genuine righteousness leads to life, but pursuing evil leads to death. Those with twisted minds are detestable to the Lord. The wicked will not go unpunished, but the offspring of the righteous will escape.
Perfect, thanks. So that was the first section we'll look at, and as we were reading through that, and as you're thinking about it a little bit now, is there a one-sentence summary that you could think of that would kind of encapsulate verses 1 to 21? Is there like a summary sentence you could think of that did all that? Chapter 11, 1 to 21.
I mean, I don't know if I could sum it up in one sentence. I think it would be like showing us the contrast between the wicked and the righteous, and especially as to how the wicked kind of bring their own judgment upon themselves, and also how the devices of the wicked eventually prove vain because they don't avail, such as the riches of the wicked. The riches of the wicked do not profit in the day of judgment, and
Yeah, and it was more of a trick question that I asked because it's really difficult to give a one-sentence summary of, a large section like that of Proverbs. And even though this whole section is together, and we'll look at how that is, but it's extremely difficult. So it was more of a trick question. Hans Finzel says that it's nigh impossible at times to make a one-sentence summary. And, you can say, yeah, contrast the upright and the wicked, which was the kind of general theme that I mentioned in the summary of these chapters that we're reading. But anything more specific than that, you can't really do that. You can't really do it. Something that kind of encapsulates the whole there. You can't get more specific than that, and that's extremely general. This is what the upright do. This is what the wicked do. This is how the upright act. This is how the wicked act. Anyway, we have to look at some different ways to kind of structure this. So let me bring it out and kind of why we're talking about this in one whole section. And this is from Walter Kaiser again. It's a summary of Dwayne Garrett's structure that he brings out from the book of Proverbs in this one chapter, which I think we're actually probably going to change our commentaries, because now we're getting into some difficult stuff, and I don't think our Tyndale Old Testament commentary is really, it's not too good for this kind of stuff. But Dwayne Garrett's commentary, New American Commentary series, does do this very well. So I think we'll switch commentaries today. Well, not really today, but for the next study. So if you're in the commentary group, you'll start seeing the New American Commentary as we go along. So anyway, let's read this real quick. So Proverbs 11, 1-21, which we just read, it forms an inclusio with the concepts of what is an abomination to the Lord and what is his delight in verses 1 and 20. So an inclusio is a grammatical, kind of almost rhetorical structure as far as writing is concerned, where you have either a key word or phrase at the beginning of the section, and then you have that same or very similar key word or phrase at the end of the section. So you can then see that it's all supposed to be part of one section. So we can see, if we look at verse 1, if we go ahead and read that, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, keyword, but a just way is his delight, keyword. So we have those two keywords starting off this section, and we know that they're keywords because we see them repeated again later on in verse 20. The perverse in heart are an abomination to the Lord, but the blameless in their walk are his delight. And that doesn't strictly end that section, because verse 21 follows verse 20, poetically speaking. Assuredly, the evil man will not go unpunished, but the descendants of the righteous will be delivered. So we can take that whole verses 20-21 as that part, ending that whole section, 1-21. So that's something you can kind of keep an eye out for. You probably didn't notice it on your first read through. I didn't notice it on my first, second, and third read through, and so on. But this is the kind of thing that takes really close, intensive study. You read it over and over and over again, and specifically look for these kinds of things, and you'll likely find them. But we don't have time, unfortunately, to do that in our one Bible study. But I'm just pointing these things out. Proverbs is very poetic, and especially as we go along, we'll see more of those kinds of things, like inclusio. So then he continues on. The smaller collections that are found between these two bookends, abomination, delight, those two bookends, as it were, form subunits of this main theme. So before, you might not have seen the structure, and hopefully we're bringing out the structure a little more so you can organize this better. Verses 1-4 describe God's abhorrence of fraud and his promise that the wrongfully gained wealth of the wicked will do them no good in the day of judgment, while humility and integrity are the best guides. So you have sub-units here, subsections, subtopics that all support the main topic, which is kind of bookended between the words abomination and delight, repeated on. And there's a second sub-theme within this larger theme of God's abhorring the wicked, but delighted in the righteous. It's found in the couplet of verses 7 and 8. And you see, we have these two verses are bound together by another inclusio, with wicked in the beginning of verse 7 and at the end of verse 8. So you have inclusio inception. You have an inclusio inside of a larger inclusio. And you have more sub-themes. Verses 9-13 and verse 9 and 12 parallel each other in that they treat destruction of a neighbor through slander, while verses 10 to 11 make up an obvious parallel couplet. This is kind of hard to follow if you don't have your Bible open, but if you do have it open, or you can just kind of scroll up in the chat and you see where Matt kind of pasted the verses there, just follow along and see, oh, I see this word here, and I see that same word later on, and I can see the inclusio there, I can see the parallelism there. Verse 13, while outside the chiasmus, renders an afterword on the subject of the tongue. Not only are the wicked malicious in the use of their tongues, but they're not discreet. They just cannot be trusted. And a chiasm is it's a pattern, rhetorical, poetic pattern, where you have, well, there are different structures of chiasm. You can think of it as a pyramid. Sometimes you have an even number of statements, though, but it's basically a pattern of A, B, B, A, if you're familiar with poetry. Or you could say A, B, C, B, A, where you have your first statement, A, and then the last statement. Let me just kind of write this out. So it might look something like this. And there we go. So it might look something like that. This is just a general pattern that you can kind of go add more statements to and more parallelisms. But you have A, B, C, B, A. And you have the kind of negating kind of quote thing there, the single quotes on the second ones, because usually they might be antithetical or different than the first ones, but still on the same note. I know that's confusing. It'll make more sense as we go along. I'll try to keep bringing these out little by little as we keep going through this section of Proverbs. And if you have the commentary, he'll explain all of this for you. And the C letter is usually the climax of the particular statements, the strongest statement. It's the one that we're bringing focus to. So that's the way you can think of it. A, B, C, B, A. Sometimes you have even numbered ones, A, B, B, A. Anyway, we're just talking about structure here. You don't have to get too confused. Just know that there is an order to all of this, even though it seems really disordered on first read. Or it might not seem very disordered. You could be like Matt and just go, oh yeah, this is so ordered to me. I can see all the organization immediately. So yeah, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you guys. We won't do this for everything because we just don't have the time. I just want to show you that there is an order to this section of Proverbs, even if it might not seem that way at first read. So Hat says, I think this is a definition for a chiasm. Repetition of any group of verse elements, including rhyme and grammatical structure, in reverse order, such as the rhyme scheme A, B, B, A. Yeah, so it starts out with, for instance, going back to mine, you have A, B, C, that's one order, and then you have B and then A. So it's not A, B, A, B, that's a different kind of structure, not a chiasm. It's A, B, B, A. All right. Any questions on what we looked at on the structure? Then we'll get into the actual, verses themselves. But any questions on the structure? If you're confused on a chiasm, or what on earth are we talking about here? That's fine, Matt. If anything, all I want you to get is the main point that there is a structure to it. You don't have to fully understand what that structure is at this point in time. Just know that it's there. Yeah, they definitely do fall under hermeneutics. How do we interpret this section? Well, we look at it as a section, first of all, 1 to 21. We see that because of the inclusio. All right, let's get into the verses themselves then, real quickly, then we'll keep reading on. So, she's the luckiest girl says, these verses to me say a lot about how the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be punished. Is the reward or punishment only to do with heaven and hell, or is it also rewards and punishments in our life on earth? That's a great question. I'll just quickly answer that. And pretty much when you're reading Proverbs, it's all mostly in the earthly sense. So we're talking about rewards on earth, we're talking about punishments on earth, and sometimes you can see echoes beyond that, though. You can see echoes beyond that, such as perhaps the day of wrath. Is that a specific, ultimate kind of judgment day? Perhaps. And we could take it that way. But usually throughout Proverbs, especially the previous chapters we've read, the context has always been earthly. But there are echoes of something in the afterlife, both for the righteous and for the wicked. But it's not explicitly spelled out in Proverbs. Thankfully, we have the New Testament, which helps us a lot in kind of specifying all of that. But as far as Proverbs is concerned, mostly earthly, with echoes of the afterlife. Consequences there. So Matt says perhaps both. Yeah. And it definitely will be both. We know that it's both. Whether or not Proverbs says it's both is a different question, but yeah. And we will talk about what those rewards are specifically. And one thing to keep in mind, this is in preparation for a particular verse that I'll bring out later on. One thing to keep in mind is that rewards are not necessarily things that we would always deem as good material things. So rewards are also talked about as virtues in Proverbs. They're also talked about as discipline in Proverbs as well. If a father truly loves his son, according to Proverbs, that father will be disciplining that son. And discipline is not fun. It's not a fun thing to do. And yet, that's looked on as something good in the book of Proverbs, that discipline. So we will be disciplined. And that's considered as a reward, and it's considered as a signal, a sign that your father loves you if you're disciplined. Disciplined correctly, of course. And yeah, Mitchie says there's a difference between punishments and discipline. So yeah, that's definitely good to bring out. Yeah, riches do not profit in the day of wrath. All right, let's get to the next section then. As we're reading along, just keep in mind, main overarching theme, even though it's very general, contrasting the righteous and the wicked. It'll help, even if it's very general. It'll help. So let's see who else reacted. So Capybara Man, Dog Man, could you please read verses 22 and 22 to 31 of chapter 11?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. I'm reading from the ESV. Be assured, an evil person will not go unpunished, but all right, verse 22. Like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. The desire of the righteous ends only in good, the expectation of the wicked in wrath. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. The people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. Whoever diligently seeks good seeks favor, but evil comes to him who searches for it. Whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Whoever troubles his own household will inherit the wind, and the fool will be servant to the wise of heart. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and whoever captures souls is wise. If the righteous is repaid on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner?
Yeah, wonderful. All right, that's the next section, last section of chapter 11. And we're not going to get into the structure of this, but real quickly, before we bring it out to you guys, on She's the Luckiest Girl's question earlier, are we talking about rewards and punishments on earth, or perhaps heavenly rewards, eternal consequences? What are we talking about? So verse 31 there, if the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? So specifically talks about on earth, but this is where I would disagree with the NASB translation. Let me just bring it out real quick. So this is from our other commentary, our old one now, Derek Kidner's commentary, verse 31 of chapter 11. Strict requital, according to the RSV at least. It can have a reassuring or a threatening ring. The LXX makes it the latter. And the LXX is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. You can think of it as just that, basically. LXX is short for Septuagint, and it's the number of translators that were on it. Anyway, LXX is the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Try not to get too crazy. So that's what it is. Jesus read from this. He also read from the Hebrew Bible. You see the LXX quoted from elsewhere by some of the New Testament writers as well. That's what it is. Just the Greek translation. It's supported by being quoted in full in 1 Peter 4:18. If the righteous scarcely be saved. In other words, nobody sins with impunity. Not even Moses or David, much less the confirmed rebel. It's important to notice that in 1 Peter 4:12-19, where this is quoted, even the suffering of the righteous under persecution is partly viewed, as in this proverb, as a judgment, whatever other aspects it wears. So if we read the NASB translation, which Dogman thankfully brought up, we see the word rewarded there, instead of requited or even punished. So that's why I don't like the NASB translation. Pretty much that right there. We see some evidence in the LXX that we are talking about requital either in the general sense or more specifically some kind of punishment. We also see that supported in 1 Peter, where Peter quotes this passage, and the Greek uses specifically kind of moves us toward a translation that says requital. And if we look at the specific word in Mounce's expository dictionary, we see a couple options here. So reward is an option for this particular verse, but it could also be translated as repaid. To be repaid or be fulfilled. And really context determines what we're talking about here. So in Proverbs, it could be either one. And in 1 Peter, it's more specifically toward, repayment of their deeds, either good or bad. And, I don't completely accept the NASB as for everything it says, but in general, I do like the NASB translation. I'd say that the NASB is too specific in this case. So you have these options. You could say rewarded. That's a genuine option. You could say repaid. You could say requited. You could say punished. Those are your options, basically, for this context. I would say that the NASB goes in too specifically. It interprets the verse for you and doesn't allow you to say, well, maybe the righteous here are also punished. It's too specific. So a more ambiguous translation, like requited or repaid, would allow you, the reader, to be able to judge by the context. What kind of repayment are we talking about? Is it going to be good or is it going to be bad repayment? So a slightly more ambiguous translation will give you, the reader, a little more power there. So as we're looking specifically at the context of this verse, right, we looked at the LXX, we looked at 1 Peter, and we looked at the Hebrew a little bit. Specifically in the context of this passage, if the righteous will be requited in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? So it's talking about something given to the righteous and saying that how much more the wicked and the sinner. Oh, if the righteous are rewarded in the earth, how much more reward will the wicked and the sinner receive? See, it doesn't make too much sense in the context of this specific verse. But if we say repaid, if the righteous will be repaid in the earth, perhaps punished on the earth, how much more will the wicked and the sinner be repaid or punished on the earth? So specifically there, I think the better translation would be requited or, repaid. But rewarded is possible semantically as far as that goes. Anyway, I just wanted to bring one of my pet peeves out. If I could change the NASB translation. to something a little better. But other translations do say requited, like the RSV, for instance. It says requited. I wonder what the ESV says. The ESV says repaid, if the righteous is repaid on the earth. So I'd consider that a better translation at this specific point. Anyway, any other questions that you guys had on anything in the passage that we read? Just keep in mind the broad theme, righteous versus wicked. So Luckiest Girl says, so if the wicked does anything, whether good or bad, then their repayment is greater no matter what. Like if wicked do good deeds, they will have a greater reward than a righteous person who does the same good deed. That's a great question. What do you guys think about that? How would you answer it?
Well, I mean, Scripture says that our own righteousness is like filthy rags. And so without reconciliation in a covenant relationship, all of our good deeds really amount to nothing because they're done outside of the covenant with God. But when we're in covenant with God through Christ, our good deeds are rewarded, although they don't have to be, because they're given by grace. And our bad deeds, if we repent, are forgiven. Whereas if you don't come through Christ, the good deeds are just filthy rags. They're just, you come before God and say, well, this is the reason why you should let me into heaven. And he says, well, no, it was through my son that you have this gift of eternal life and salvation, not through your own good works. And also same with the bad things. Christ is our substitute. So if the wicked do wickedness, that's to be expected, but they're going to be held accountable. And they have not sought forgiveness nor reconciliation from the King whose laws we've transgressed.
Yeah, that was excellent. So from a New Testament perspective, we have Christ's righteousness imputed onto us, and God has prepared good works for us to walk in. It's not us getting all of that good stuff by our own strength or anything like that, but it's God's work. And, even in the Old Testament, like Matt said in Isaiah, our works are as filthy rags. Literally there you could translate that as menstrual cloth, but you don't have to. That's what the LEB translates it as. But they're filthy rags. Our good works are useless. They don't do anything on our own. Sorry, guys. Just on a translation craze there. But, yeah. And if in the context of Proverbs specifically, even if you don't go as far as the New Testament perspective, or as far as Isaiah says, which you should, but in the context of Proverbs, the righteous person and the wicked person are contrasted by the deeds that they do. So if the wicked person is doing the same stuff as a righteous person is, that's a contradiction. There wouldn't be a wicked person if the wicked person was walking the same way as a righteous person would be doing. But in that context as well, there are other things that the righteous person has an advantage, you could say. For instance, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're told to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our strength. The wicked person can't do that to any decent degree, unlike the righteous person who has the new heart that God gave him. So even if they do the same deed in a shallow sense, the righteous person is doing it with God in mind, and he's doing it because he loves God, while the wicked person, even if he's doing the same exact deed, he doesn't have that in mind at all. He's failing that commandment completely. All right, we'll move on now to the next chapter, verses 1 to 28. Maybe not all that. We'll just do 1 to 20 first. So let's see if anyone has reacted. No one new has reacted. So Mia, could you please read verses 1 to 20 of chapter 12?
Yep, I got it. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but one who hates correction is stupid. The good person obtains favor from the Lord, but he condemns a person who schemes. Man cannot be made secure by wickedness, but the root of the righteous is immovable. A capable wife is her husband's crown, but a wife who causes shame is like rottenness in his bones. The thoughts of the righteous are just, but guidance from the wicked leads to deceit. The words of the wicked are a deadly ambush, but the speech of the upright rescues them. The wicked are overthrown and perish, but the house of the righteous will stand. A man is praised for his insight, but yet have a servant, than to act important but have no. A righteous man cares about his animal's health, but even the merciful acts of the wicked are cruel. The one who works his land will have plenty of food, but whoever chases fantasies lacks sense. The wicked desire what evil men have, but the root of the righteous produces fruit. An evil man is trapped by his rebellious speech, but a righteous one escapes. A man will be satisfied with good by the words of his mouth, and the work of will reward him. The fool's way is right in his own eyes, but whoever listens to counsel is wise. A fool's displeasure is known at once, but whoever ignores an insult is sensible. Whoever speaks the truth declares what is right, but a false witness deceit. There is one who speaks rashly like a piercing sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue only a moment. Deceit is in the hearts of those who plot evil, but those who promote peace have joy.
Thank you. So that was the first section of chapter 12. Hopefully you saw some really good advice there. And even more than that, some godly wisdom, and also in accordance with the main overarching theme, contrasting the upright and the wicked. Now there's a couple things I want to bring out here as you guys are kind of thinking about this section. I know it was a lot, and I wish we had the time to go through each and every verse and just study it completely, but unfortunately we don't have that kind of time. But one thing I want to bring out in verse 12, as you guys are kind of thinking about things. So verse 12, let's see if I can bring this out. Proverbs 12:12 in the NASB, and Proverbs 12:12 in the RSV. So this is the same verse, and it didn't do the NASB. ESV is fine. Whoever is wicked covets the spoil of evildoers, but the root of the righteous bears fruit. And if we look at the RSV, it says the strong tower of the wicked comes to ruin, but the root of the righteous stands firm. How on earth did they get strong tower from this? And the basic answer to that is that they didn't. They emended the verse, which means that they didn't think that the text was good enough for this particular verse, and so they input their own interpretation of what the text would have looked like, even though it's not supported in the text itself. So I did say the RSV earlier was good. It said requited, which basically means repaid. But now I don't like the RSV at all because it emended this verse. So yeah, the RSV did that. So you don't get strong tower from the Hebrew text, but they thought that, no, this doesn't make too much sense. You know, the illustration kind of switches here, and so we're just going to put strong tower in here. You don't get that at all. Let me just bring out what the UBS handbook says on it. Because you know you can get some random opinion from some guy on the internet like me. But I do like to bring out some commentaries at least. So this is from the UBS handbook on Proverbs. This verse illustrates the compact structure of many of these ancient sayings. So on the next paragraph, whoever loves discipline loves... Oh, whoops, that was the wrong one. Just ignore that one. And we will look at this one. So ignore the first one, read the second one. Translators have made many attempts to arrive at a meaningful translation of this verse. It's difficult. It's a difficult verse. The RSV rendering makes several changes in the Hebrew text. As it stands, the Hebrew text of the whole verse appears to say, the wicked desires the net of evil men, and literally translated, it's net of evil men, but as far as meaning goes, you're talking about the spoils or the booty of evil men, the spoils there. NASB says booty, ESV says spoils. But the root of the righteous gives. In this form, there's no clear contrast between the lines, and line 2 seems to be incomplete. The strong tower of the wicked comes to ruin. REB, similar to the RSV, modifies the Hebrew to get the stronghold of the wicked crumbles like clay. The word translated net in the literally rendering above may also be understood to mean gain, booty, or refuge. Taken in one of these senses, line 1 may be translated, the wicked covets the gain of evil people, and not, strong tower or anything like that. So, it's good to keep these things in mind, and you don't need to know a lot of Hebrew. You don't have to have the UBS handbook on hand with any of this stuff, for any of this stuff. But you should have multiple translations to consult. As long as you have multiple translations to consult, you'll avoid all of these issues that I just brought up. So the ESV translates it as repaid earlier on, that particular verse we were looking at, and where the NASB kind of failed a little bit. And here, if you just had the RSV, you're just reading strong tower, you'll also see in the footnotes of the RSV where it says, this text has been, amended or whatever. You also see that some multiple translations will help you. You don't need a great understanding of Hebrew. So Matt asks, is this accurate? The wicked desires the plunder of evil men, but the root of the righteous flourishes. I'd say that's pretty accurate. That looks good to me. But if it is something that is causing a lot of trouble for you, if you're like, why does this translation say this and that says that, then, some knowledge of Hebrew will help you. More importantly, commentaries will help you. But overall, multiple translations, and you won't have to worry too much. And keep an eye on the footnotes as well. The RSV footnote will tell you, we had some difficulties with this particular verse, so we had to do this and that and say strong tower, but other translations don't say that. To be fair, it is a difficult passage to translate. But the solution is not changing the text of the Hebrew. But you can see that the RSV wasn't trying to pull the blinds over your eyes and try to sneak this in deceptively. It gave you a footnote and told you what it was doing, which is good, transparency. I'm not trying to lie to you or anything like that. Just about all the sections of the Old Testament were written in ancient biblical Hebrew, but there are some sections written in Aramaic, such as some passages from Daniel and some other small areas too. But yeah, mostly Hebrew, some Aramaic, tiny little bit. So Luckiest Girl says, from what I understand, the meaning of this verse is that the wicked will feel without and desire what other wicked people have, but the righteous have a strong foundation and will never have to feel without. Or feel lacking is what I think. But yeah, and I think that really gets at the illustration as well, what you said there. The root of the righteous yields fruit. So instead of going out to other people desiring what they have, in other passages of Proverbs we see people stealing from other people, murdering other people, stealing other people's wives, and things like that. But the root of the righteous yields fruit. So this is something that the righteous person has in and of himself, and that's a popular illustration in the New Testament as well. The root is usually Christ and God providing for that righteous person. So yeah, I think what you said there, Luckiest Girl, really gets at what the illustration is talking about. Okay, let's read the last section now. I know we're going through this fast and we're talking about really tiny details as we go along, but if you want to say something on a proverb, please do so, because that is just wonderful. All right, let's get to the next section, which is 21 to 28. And Dogman, could you please... Oh, we have other people. Sorry, Dogman. Faithful Panda, could you please read 21 to 28 of chapter 12?
Sure. Okay, I'm reading from the Message version. And 21 says, "No evil can overwhelm a good person, but the wicked have their hands full of it. God can't stomach liars. He loves the company of those who keep their word. Prudent people don't flaunt their knowledge. Talkative fools broadcast their silliness. The diligent find freedom in their work. The lazy are oppressed by work. Worry weighs us down. A cheerful word picks us up. A person survives misfortune, but a wicked life invites disaster. A lazy life is an empty life, but an early to rise gets the job done. Good men and women travel right into life. Sin detours you straight to hell."
Thanks. So, just a quick couple things. The Message is a paraphrase translation, and that's fine. I will say that, some people don't like the Message. I've grown to like it a little more these days, and as far as this section is concerned, I think it did a decent job, a pretty good job at, giving the meaning of the text. And I will have to give credit to the Message translation, because as time went on, the Message translation did get input from other biblical scholars on the translation and how things were supposed to be written and translated, such as Craig Blomberg. He had some input in consultation for the Message translation, I believe. And overall, Craig Blomberg says, the Message is fine as far as paraphrases go. So I just want to bring that out since we were on the topic of translations a little bit. It can be good at times to get another perspective, like a paraphrase. So that was fine. That was good. One thing I don't really like is that it said hell at the end of verse 28. And I mean, I think that's too specific. It's kind of like the problem with the NASB, where it gives you too specific a translation, which takes away some of your options as a reader. So most translations would translate that word as death, and in its pathway there is no death. And that would give you the option to say, what kind of death is this talking about? Is this talking about, just physical death, or are there some echoes into the afterlife as far as that's concerned? So that's the question there. But other than that one little point, I think the Message was good in this section. All right. Any questions on this passage? Any questions or thoughts or comments? This is a shorter section, so if you want to expound on a particular proverb that you thought really hit you, go ahead.
Well, now that I think of it, with the very last verse that talks about how sin's a detour to hell, back then, because I took a Bible class in college that talked about how there was no heaven or hell theology, how that what they believed was in Sheol, which was a place where you would go for death.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of confuses me with the Message translation.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to be, critical to some degree of the translations we read. And yeah, you're pretty much right. Mostly they thought of the grave, Sheol, and they had paradise as well in some degree. And you see probably some of the strongest mentions of an afterlife in the book of Daniel, but other than some allusions, you don't really get the full, robust afterlife theology that the New Testament brings forth in the Old Testament. You don't see that when you just look at the Old Testament. But yeah, I would say that it's best to render this as death in verse 28. And Nat had a question on 12, or had a thought on 12:3. Really spoke to him. Did you have any? Oh, so Nat knocked. How do you pronounce it? He reacted. So knocked. What are your thoughts on 12:3? What really stood out to you specifically?
Well, in verse 3, I don't know. I mean,
You could relate it to your life as well if you want.
All right, sure. I mean, personally, I just feel like God is satisfied with like people who obey His commandments, and He condemns those who practice wickedness, if that makes sense. And like I just feel as though God has His hands upon those who practice righteousness and stuff. So yeah, I guess I don't know. I just I don't know. Sorry, it's just like when I was reading it, it just like kind of spoke to me a little bit. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that was good. And I like what you said that God has a hand in helping out the righteous at these times. And you have to ask, what is the root of the righteous in that verse? And as we pretty much concluded earlier, the best interpretation for that is probably we're talking about God supporting and nourishing that believer, that righteous person, by the root. And for the illustration too, a man will not be established by wickedness. Establishment has some kind of sense of stability, to be firm, to be prepared, according to Mounce's expository dictionary on the Hebrew there. And with that illustration, the root of the righteous will not be moved. And as we look at roots, what do roots do? They keep someone stable, right? They keep that person firm and in place. And that's what the root does in this particular verse. And later on, in verse 12 that we looked at, with the big translation between RSV and pretty much every other translation. The RSV is the only one different, along with the REB. The wicked man desires the booty of evil men, but the root of the righteous yields fruit. Same Hebrew word. And we're looking at the root of the righteous. And that is more of talking about the nourishment aspect of things. The words are very similar there. It's pretty much the same lexical form of the Hebrew. The root of the righteous will not be moved, but the root of the righteous yields fruit. So yeah, I like that. 12:3 is good. All right, one thing I want to bring out before we close it out was one question. Verse 21. Let me just copy and paste that there for you guys. Hopefully it helps a little bit. So Proverbs 12:21, no ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. The NASB says that no harm befalls the righteous. So here's my question, and I'll phrase it kind of aggressively. If I took this verse, I read this verse, and I said to you, oh look, well, if you're just be righteous, no harm will fall upon you. At all. Nothing. That's what the verse says. How would you guys respond?
Aggressive Mark is dangerous. No, I'm just kidding. So, if I can get the words out. Again, we see this is a generalization of a theme that's in Proverbs in particular. We see again and again that those who are lazy, they go hungry. Those who are cheating, they will eventually be found out. Those who lie, et cetera, et cetera. So we see in the circumstantial sense that there is great harm to wickedness just in this life, let alone in the life to come, which is hinted at when it says riches do not help in the day of wrath, which from what I know about the Old Testament, there was some view of the afterlife and of eternal judgment and stuff because, Christ, he fulfilled the old covenant. He did not rewrite it, But so when he talked about heaven, hell, weeping, gnashing of teeth, these were things that at least were mentioned in the Old Testament. But anyways, so basically it's an overgeneralization of a theme in Proverbs in particular, where it's showing us that the wicked have lots of pain and trouble because of their wickedness. It's a consequence of their own actions and also judgment from God. Whereas the righteous generally live at peace and without harm because they're kind to their neighbor, because they're honest in their investments and in their sales, and because they honor the Lord. Of course, we see before Proverbs, Job was written historically, previously. So they already had the book of Job in their, library of books. So we know that according to the betrayal of Job, he was for the most part, a righteous man. Maybe besides some pride, I guess, but generally he was called righteous. So we see that this idea that the righteous will have absolutely no pain obviously is not what Proverbs was implying, unless they were ignoring all of the previous books they already had in their Jewish library, which said there was other people like Joseph or Job, or I'm trying to think of who was before. There were others, but there are instances that they would have theologically to believe that it's a general statement.
Yeah. And I like what you said about Job, because my interpretation, the false one, the bad one, my bad interpretation of that verse, oh, if you just are righteous, no harm will fall upon you. It kind of sounds like Job's friends, right? And they were asking him, what did you do wrong, Job? You must have done something wrong for all this evil to fall upon you. If you were righteous, really righteous, then you wouldn't have this problem. But yeah. Any other thoughts on the passage of the verse, on the bad interpretation?
Well, you're still gonna suffer even if you are righteous. It says that in the New Testament with Christ. Paul mentioned that, like, just because Christ suffered through life, it is a gift that we will experience the same suffering that Christ went through. So if we're righteous, we're still gonna go through difficult things.
Yeah, that's very true. So the bad interpretation would be in contradiction to all of the New Testament and some passages in the Old Testament. And I like what you said too, that this is actually a good thing. And it goes back to what Mitchie said earlier, where she made a distinction between discipline and just strictly punishment. And I think that's good. So we don't have too much time, but if you have final thoughts, just drop them in the chat. I want to bring up a couple things on this verse. Number one, got to remember general principles, like what Matt said, and like what Walter Kaiser said, as we defined what a proverb was and the whole genre of the book of Proverbs. We're talking about general truths that can be observed in the world, and general truths and principles from that. It's not a one-to-one, 100% promise every time. There are some of those in the book of Proverbs, such as the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. There are some of those in there, but when we're talking about things like this, those are just general truths. So another thing is that we have to ask the question, what does it mean by harm here? What does Solomon mean by harm? What kinds of specific examples of harm and ill have we seen? So we've seen specific harm from a wicked deed, like sleeping with another man's wife, and now that man is very angry and is going to kill that person. So those are some specific things. And on the other hand, there are some things that we would actually not consider to be harm as far as Proverbs is concerned when we talk about discipline. A father loves his son. He will discipline him if the father really loves that son, and discipline is not a fun thing. And you could take that as some kind of ill to experience, but Proverbs doesn't understand it that way. It's actually a really good thing to be correctly disciplined. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and especially with the testimony of the New Testament, and even the Old Testament as well. There is no one who is perfectly, utterly righteous, minus Christ, of course. But as far as we are concerned, there's no one who's perfectly righteous. So when it says no harm befalls the righteous, you could understand righteous being there as perfectly righteous. And like in English, we could talk about a good person. Yeah, he's a good person. He's a good egg. We don't mean perfectly good, but we could also talk about goodness in terms of God's goodness and God's righteousness as the standard, which none of us reach. So you can talk about that in a couple of different ways. Same with Hebrew and the Old Testament as well. You can also talk about righteousness as far as general adherence to covenant obligations in that kind of sense in the Old Testament. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be general righteous. It could be perfectly righteous or just general covenant obligations. So those are the things I wanted to bring up. But yeah, if you keep those principles in mind, you will easily solve 80% of the problems that people have with the book of Proverbs when they take these things as 100% every single individual time promises. So yeah, just keep those principles in mind. I think that is pretty much it. I don't know how we got to Dogman again and everything. Faithful Panda read and then Noct gave us some ideas about 12.3, and we somehow come to Dogman, but we'll give him a break. So Mia, could you please pray for us and close it out?
Sure. Father, thank you for letting us gather today and study your word as a group. Thank you for a good Bible study and the time we were able to spend on it. I pray that you would watch over us as we go out from here. Help us to apply all that we have learned to our daily lives and to continue to be in your word this week until we are able to study again together. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you all for being here. I had a really great time with you guys. If you want to have the commentary, just send me a direct message. It's going to be from the New American Commentary this time, from Dwayne Garrett, that Old Testament scholar. So if you want that, let me know. There's going to be a lot of new stuff in it. You're going to learn about monocolons, bicolons, tricolons, and proverbial merismus, all sorts of things. But hopefully that'll help us take on the structure of Proverbs and learn a lot more.